But there's a point there. I'm enough of a properly trained economist to believe that there are some circumstances in which private spending, people buying stuff for their own, on their own decisions, is the best way to go. But even in any Econ 101 textbook, such as Krugman Wells or Banku, will tell you that there's actually only, that's not true of everything. The standard typology, there's a little matrix you draw. You say, distinguish among goods in two dimensions. Are they rival or not? Rival meaning if I consume some of this good, there's less left for everybody else. So a cheeseburger is rival. If I eat that cheeseburger, you can't. Having breathable air is not rival, or having a country that's safe from foreign enemies is not rival. My having that doesn't reduce the amount of being safe from foreign enemies that you have. The other dimension is excludable or non-excludable. Is there even any way that someone can charge for access to the good? And only if a good is both excludable and rival is it a natural candidate for being something that private spending can provide at best. And then there are other issues, even on that dimension, like monopoly power and so on. But we know for sure that there are a lot of things, like air traffic control, that don't fit, that you can't count on the private sector to provide. We talk about the opposite of a rival excludable good as a non-rival, non-excludable good, like air traffic control, which is which is the classic public good. And we can go on. There are gray areas and so on, but it's clear that there's a lot of public goods out there. And we have to be careful also to understand that even things that can look like it's a pure private good often have a public good component. So education is a private good. It's, if the school teachers who teach one child, that's one less other, there's competition among children for resources, and it's possible to certainly refuse to let somebody into a private school or a public school if people chose. But while having an education is a private good, having an educated population is a public good. And for virtually all of this country's history, we've always believed that having an educated population was a very important thing, both for us as a democracy and for us as an economic power. Healthcare, you can certainly say that healthcare is a private good, but there clearly is a strong sense among all of us, which is to some extent economic, but I think also moral, that our fellow citizens should not be denied adequate healthcare just because they're short on cash. And so there are public good aspects to lots of things. We're always, in our society, making some choice at the margin. There, I can talk like an economist. Some choice at the margin about how much we're going to be spending on public goods and how much on private goods. There are very strong reasons to think that these past 30 years, we pushed that margin way too far towards the private goods. And if you want a motivating example about why it is I think that it's compelling. Now I could, and people at this conference to some extent are already doing this, you could go through and start to do cost-benefit analysis of public goods that we aren't providing that we really should be, and list up, and there are a lot of things that we ought to be doing. But I think I can't do that now. What I can do is give you why I think it's very clear. So just the quick phrase, revealing my age here, but I think it's still important. Anybody remember ketchup as a vegetable? Now, for 30 years, this country has been dominated by a political movement that, well, Ronald Reagan said it. It's a nice, straightforward statement. The government is not the solution, the government is the problem. And the goal was always to have less government. You cut taxes ostensibly out of the belief that there's this wonderful, magical stuff, but there was always sort of an outer truth and an inner truth there, that the outer truth was you told the rubes that you really believed that tax cuts paid for themselves, but what you believed actually was that tax cuts would deprive the government of revenue and you could starve the beast. And so if you do in fact manage to create a situation where revenue is shrinking and you start looking for spending cuts, Well, you look for it wherever you can. And so what actually happened, the true story was that in 1981, David Stockman, Reagan's budget director, trying to slash money for the school lunch program, was faced with some guidelines on, that were requirements on what a school lunch had to include, which included a vegetable. So he tried to define ketchup as a vegetable so as to be able to cut money. Well, he didn't get away with that, but they in fact did massively cut funding for the school lunch program. And I was looking at the numbers a little bit, and it has never really recovered as a share of GDP. Whatever, school lunches have been shortchanged ever since. And as of the last number I was able to get, we now spend $2.57 for a school lunch, which is stretched a bit by having a bunch of agricultural surplus in it, which of course means that the things are grotesquely unhealthy. And there's a public good being lost here, which is the future health of the American populace. That kind of story plays out throughout our system. All across our system, we've had shortchanging of public expenditures at all levels. So at the federal level, at the state, the local level, constant pressure to cut taxes, to keep revenue down, and then crusading against government spending. And you know what happens, this is the real world, what happens when you do that is not that the most wasteful pieces of government spending get cut. What happens is that government spending, of course, on the most vulnerable people, who also tend to have the least political voice, gets cut. And even more so, what happens is that investment gets cut. Things, if you're a hard-pressed mayor, hard-pressed governor, you can't raise taxes because you're under enormous political constraints, but you don't have enough money, and you have some kind of balanced budget requirement, or even if you don't, the fact of the matter is that you do have to worry about borrowing. What do you cut? Well, the things that have their negative consequences in the future, not too immediately. So school lunches, well, to some extent people will complain about the poor quality school lunches, but a lot of the consequences of feeding kids badly will only pop up 20, 30 years later. Not your problem. Cut back on maintenance, infrastructure, cut back on investments in education, in research. All of those things get cut. It's not that easy to quantify. For what it's worth, if you look at infrastructure spending in America, as a share of GDP, it peaked under that socialist Dwight Eisenhower, fell a lot, and took another jog down in the Reagan years. It stayed at about that level, around 2% of GDP, thereabouts, for quite a while, but that's gross public investment. What you don't get there is the extent to which all that stuff we did build during the Eisenhower and to some extent the Kennedy years is getting old and is depreciating, and we're not keeping up with it. And you go through the various things we look at, and you do international comparisons, which are not perfect. There's nothing that says that necessarily the rest of the world is right, but if we tend to think of ourselves still as being always the most modern, the most having the slickest. We're the richest country. We should have all the best infrastructure. And we don't. We're lagging on transport infrastructure. We're lagging on education. Even our sense of ourselves as the cutting edge of technology is to an important extent based on the way things were a decade ago, not the way things are right now. So I'm looking at, it is actually increasingly stunning to look at how we're falling behind on broadband, both on access and even more so on speed. This balance has got to be redressed. The crisis offers an opportunity to at least restart that conversation. To say, now this is of course exactly what conservatives are deathly afraid of, that once we start talking about useful things we can do that will also help sustain employment, people will look at it afterwards and say, gee, maybe those were useful things too. But that's exactly the point. We should be talking now. We have spent 30 years shortchanging public investment, broadly defined. In the name of government is bad, private sector is good, we've been shortchanging the things that government can do to make us a richer and better society in the long term. It's about time to start moving that pendulum back a long ways in the other direction.